Hi, I'm Melissa Dixon Jackson. I'm an instructor in the English department. I want to tell you about a strategy I started using a few years ago that I think has been really effective in improving student engagement, especially around topics that they typically aren't very interested in discussing, like commas and semicolons. So I think this can be translated to other disciplines for core knowledge, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. I want to thank the Innovations in Pedagogy team for going online this semester and for supporting all of us. And I also want to thank you for being here. So let's get started. So before I started using the peer-to-peer technique, this is what I felt like I was looking at in my classroom. A lot of disengaged students. Sometimes they would still turn in work that indicated they had been listening to me, but I really felt like I was looking at a group of people who just didn't want to be there. So I took that as a cue that I was doing something wrong. It felt even worse than that. It felt like I was doing everything wrong, and I did not enjoy being in the classroom. So I decided to start experimenting. I looked at my peers and I thought, well, they're all funnier than I am, and they're more clever than I am, and they're more attractive than I am. Maybe if I just, I don't know, take some improv classes or buy some makeup. And then I thought, you know what? I'll just flip it. I wasn't really familiar yet with the concept of flipping a classroom, but I thought, I'll make the students teach the stuff that I can tell they don't want to hear about from me. Maybe if they teach it to each other, it'll be different than hearing it from boring old me. So I'm thinking of this today as I prepared the presentation as a kind of attention bubble. The students are all operating in their own little attention bubble, and usually that is all about their cell phone or maybe a peer who's not even in the room, or a discipline that you're not teaching, or a job, who knows what it is. But I decided that I needed help piercing that attention bubble. And one way maybe I could get that is by making it so that they weren't just passive recipients of the information, but they were actively engaged. And I thought, if somebody else is teaching, then I can kind of play the role of coach in the room and make sure that everybody else is actively receiving. So I set up some strategies to make that happen. And I became a different kind of presence in the room than I had been before. So the first thing I hope you'll do is get out a journal or a notebook or some scrap paper and make a list. And that is one of the things that I did every single time a student got up to give a presentation. I would have a seat in a student desk, pull out a notebook, pull out a pen, and I would take notes. At the same time that I'm setting up myself to do that, I would insist in a gentle, polite, supportive way that all of the students also get out their notebook that was specific to our class and take notes because, guys, there's going to be a quiz at the end. So everybody would get out their journal and begin to take their notes. So the first thing I want you to do is get out your journal or your notebook, and we're going to make a list. So I want you to think about what your fundamental assumptions are about the knowledge that students walk into the room with. So for me, I was able to see this by looking at what repeatedly frustrated me when I evaluated their work. So it was things like they really didn't know, or many of them didn't know when they were writing a sentence fragment or a run-on sentence. They didn't know how to use semicolons. They didn't know what an independent clause was. They didn't know how to integrate a quotation from another text that they were using. They didn't know how to look at the credibility of a source. These are just a few things that I found myself commenting on over and over and over again, and I would get frustrated and angry at the students. And that's not a position we want to be in. So I decided to become more conscious of those assumptions and do something about it. So if you would please pause here and make a list of the things that frustrate you when you're grading, and from that you can infer what your fundamental assumptions are about student knowledge. This is maybe a little mercenary, but I also want you to think about the things that you don't enjoy teaching because the students just aren't interested, and make a quick list of those things. Now I want you to think about the things that you really love and enjoy teaching. It's fun, it's engaging, and the students actually seem to appreciate it. And finally, think about the things that you really do need to teach because they're just too complicated or too difficult for a novice to manage. If that's everything in your class, maybe that's something to think about too, because that would mean they walk into the room with a lot of fundamental knowledge that has already set them up for the more complicated stuff. So again, pause as we go through this to make your list. It'll probably be an incomplete list, but it's just a baseline to start from. So listen, you need to take the fun stuff. You need to keep the fun stuff because we got to fill our bucket, and there are some things that you just shouldn't give away. So if there's something you love teaching, do not hand that over. Keep it for yourself and love every minute of it. And the hard, complicated stuff, you're gonna have to take that too. Um, that's just the facts. So the fun stuff and the hard stuff, they need to go on the you teach list, and then we're going to try to move a lot of other things over to the students teach list. So now we'll get into the nitty-gritty of how I have tried to do this in my classroom, and how you might translate that into your own experience and perhaps into a digital online experience. So once you have your list made of material that you would be willing to hand over to the students, you need to prepare a guide. And this is probably the hardest part. I spent 2 or 3 years developing this over time before I handed it over for students to teach it. And then I spent a summer designing it and making it prettier, and adding in a visual theme. So the material should be substantive, but it should also be accessible, and you can make the tone light and kind of fun. And for me, that was using the visual theme of chickens throughout the guide. My basic strategy was to keep it as simple as I could, make it funny or silly whenever possible, to be willing to be vulnerable. So instead of assuming that they already knew material, I would assume that they didn't. And if they got mad at me, that was okay. So that required me in a way to be very vulnerable to them and assume that they really do want to learn. So even though I was seeing disengaged faces, I had to switch my attitude into one of assuming that they wanted what I had to give them, but I had to find a different way to deliver it. I make this assignment the very first day of class, although they're going to be peppered throughout the semester. So I usually do 1 or 2 essay survival kit presentations a week at the beginning of class. They only last 5 to 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes with the quiz and the question and answer period. So it's not a huge portion of your class, but it makes a huge, huge difference. So the way I do it is I cut out my table of contents from the guide, and I have each student come up and draw one randomly. I've already got the dates linked to the topic so that they go in the best possible order for my progression of assignments. And again, the student will give their presentation on that day, but everybody gets the assignment at the beginning of the semester. I'm not a huge rubric person, but they are important to the students. So I made a rubric that does double duty. It guides the student who's creating the presentation, but it also serves as a scoring rubric for the audience that's going to score the presentation. So I asked them to think about whether or not it is accurate. Does it accurately reflect the information that's in the essay survival kit that they all have in their notebooks? Is it organized and appealing? Did the student presenter rehearse and speak clearly? Did they attempt to make it engaging and interesting? And was the assessment quiz a good measure of whether or not they had understood the material being presented? So I discourage students from creating quizzes that have gotcha type questions, and I encourage them to create questions that just reinforce the knowledge. Let's face it, now and then a student is going to wait till the last minute to prepare their presentation, and they're not going to get it right, or they're going to misinterpret something that I have written, or maybe I wasn't as clear as I should have been. So I'm on my toes during these presentations, and I'm looking out for things that they aren't sharing accurately or appropriately. But if I make any corrections, I always do it in the gentlest, most supportive way possible. So I had to learn that sometimes the way I addressed students felt like I was shaming them, and I'm still working on developing a demeanor that's much more positive reinforcement, coach-like. And that's the role I play in the room. I kind of sit in a student desk, act like a student, and when I need to, make gentle and supportive corrections during the presentations. To further encourage full engagement and learning, I started requiring 2 questions at the end of the presentation before we moved on to the quiz. And sometimes those questions are just silly because it was a pretty easy presentation and they really don't have any questions, so they're just coming up with something funny to ask. And that's fine because that gives us a chance to develop rapport in the room, and laughter always helps. But sometimes the questions were more serious and they illustrated a gap in understanding. So that would give me an opportunity to address something, or the student presenter an opportunity to show a mastery that they might not have had a chance to show otherwise. So I've added that, requiring 2 questions before you move on to the quiz. If you're doing this online, you could do that through some discussion posts. So post the presentation as a narrated PowerPoint attached to a discussion post where students ask and respond to at least 2 questions before they move on to the quiz. I'm not sure how you'd manage the timing of that, but maybe it's just something that can happen simultaneously, and it still gives the student presenter an opportunity to respond, or the teacher an opportunity to make some corrections. I realized pretty early on that in order for this to work, everybody has to have skin in the game. So to make sure that the audience has skin in the game, they also get a grade on each and every essay survival kit. However, I didn't really want to add more work to my own plate, and I wanted to maximize my time. So I don't create the quiz, and I don't grade the quiz. The student presenter creates the quiz, they grade the quiz, and when we were doing this face-to-face, they would just give me the slips of paper that they did the quizzes on, and I would enter them in CourseDen. When we went online last semester, I started asking the student presenter to send me their quiz by email, and then I would create a quiz in CourseDen that automatically graded. But the trick here is to enter those grades as quick as humanly possible, because the students love that immediate feedback and it buys you time on the harder things. So because they got these quiz points and the essay survival points quickly, they did not resent it taking me a little longer to get an essay graded. So over the years, I've noticed that my student evaluation scores have gone up on speed of grading, not because I'm any faster at grading an essay, but because they're getting other feedback on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. That's positive feedback. Even if it's just a point for a quiz, that made a difference. In my strategy, the grade for the essay survival kit presentation comes from the audience listening instead of from me. So I'm not judging and evaluating them. It was important that I get out of that position in order to change the dynamic in the room. It's all the students. So the students have the scoring rubric and they grade each category up to 2 points for a total of up to 10 points. And then I receive those scores. I think this could be done with a survey perhaps on if you were doing it all online. And then I average all of those, and that's the grade I enter. Honestly, unless a student really flubbed it, they almost always made between a 9 and a 10 on those presentations. So they would have to be pretty bad to get an 8 or below. So this, in general, was a super positive experience for virtually all of my students. Here's a quick review of the steps that I've identified in working with this process. You may see some other opportunities, and if they work, let me know. Number one, identify your fundamental assumptions about what knowledge students should have and will need to be successful in your class. Two, prepare a user-friendly guide organized into simple units of instruction. The tutorials should be about 5 to 8 minutes long. Any longer and they get frustrated and bored. And again, you're not going to teach this to the student presenter. They're going to have to learn it from the guide that you've prepared. Number three, assign each student a topic. I like to do it randomly by having them draw a topic out of a hat on the first day of class. Prepare a scoring rubric for the student presenter and the student audience to use. Gently and supportively make any needed corrections during the presentation. Require that the student audience ask 2 or more questions before the quiz, and don't be frustrated if those questions are silly. Require a quiz after each presentation. That quiz will be graded by the student presenter. Average the grades on the student audience scoring rubrics. That usually takes me about 3 minutes. And then enter the grades as soon as possible because it buys you time on the more complicated grading later. 3 years ago, my student evaluations did not look like this. I'm still the same person. I never took an improv class, and I didn't get any better looking. I did, however, try a different strategy. My assignment arc is still the same. I still teach 3 essays. I still require 3 essays. I still require revisions. I still do process work leading up to it. It's all the same. The only thing I changed is how I delivered the information that would support them in completing those projects. So it's not about me, it's about the strategy, and I love it. I'm an evangelist for this method. Probably if I were being evaluated by somebody who was an expert in flipping a classroom, they would say my class isn't fully flipped, but it's flipped enough that student engagement has transformed. And I encourage you to give it a try. Again, the hard part is developing the guide in the beginning and making sure that it is accessible and clear and can actually be taught by a student. As you can probably tell, I am a big fan of this method, and I would be happy to hear from you. So if you are interested in using the method or the strategy in your class and you need a sounding board for how to transfer it to a different discipline, or if you have an idea about how I can make it even stronger, I hope you will contact me. I'm at mjackson@wesca.edu. And thanks again to Innovations in Pedagogy for giving me the opportunity to share this information, one of my very favorite topics about my very favorite thing to do, which is teaching at the University of West Georgia. Thank you.